So if we think the understanding of the physical and psychological differences between men and women are central to understanding how we should respond and behave and the advice that we should give to men and women, we should probably talk about what those differences are. You mentioned physical differences between men and women, so strength being one of them.
Yeah.
Are there any other physical differences that are really pertinent to this subject?
So strength sports are the biggest gap between men and women.
Yeah.
Sort of sprinting cardio, like short distance, there's also a big gap. And it's funny when you look at the numbers of like the fastest man in the world, the fastest woman in the world, they're not that different. But if women did not have their own reserved sporting categories, there would be no women in elite sport. Because like the fastest woman in the world would be like the 1,000th fastest man in the world or something like that. Because once you're getting into elite sports levels, that's when these differences become very obvious. And there's this expression that's, I think it's the golden ratio in endurance sport, where women are always, it's like 85% or something of what men are. Either the very most accomplished elite female athlete and the very most accomplished elite male athlete, there's always this gap. So anyway, so the cardio differences are not massive. The strength differences are pretty big.
This physical difference, what does this then mean for the subjects we were talking about as it relates to sort of sexuality and society more generally?
So it means, for instance, that I think casual sex is almost always more risky for women than it's worth it for women.
Why?
Because being alone with a man that you don't know, basically, is what we're talking about, is inherently dangerous for women just because of that physical asymmetry. 2, because women are the ones who get pregnant. Like even with the pill, even with the most reliable contraception, you've still got that small chance. And so that either means that you carry a pregnancy to term with all of its physical risks and emotional risks, or it means you have an abortion. Like basically all of those costs are borne by the woman. The man might have no idea that this has even occurred, right? So there's this kind of essential asymmetry which you can try and get past with technology, with contraceptive technology, but you can't quite, it's still there. The psychological differences between the sexes in terms of sexuality are also important. They're not as massive as, say, upper body strength, but on average, they are very, very marked. And one of those differences is that men are basically keener on casual sex than women are. Men want to jump into bed more quickly than women do.
How do we know that?
Looking cross-culturally is one big clue, because you might say, and some people do say, like there are these studies, they're quite funny, where researchers will go onto university campuses and get an attractive woman, an attractive man, and they go up to members of the opposite sex and basically proposition them and say, like, do you want to go back to mine right now? And in 0% of cases do women say yes. 0%. And this is consistent. Whereas in quite a high proportion of cases, men will say yes, right? And that is consistent across, it's been done in different times, different places. You might say, oh, it's because women are scared of slut shaming, or, that there's like a social penalty for women. And that's a little bit true. But then when you see, there's been surveys done of like basically every country in the world, to my knowledge. And in no country do women watch more porn than men. In no country do women express more of a desire for casual sex than men do. In no country do women buy sex more than men do. Like it's basically only men who buy sex. It's very, very rare for women to buy sex. When you see these gaps absolutely everywhere, I think that's a very strong indication that you're dealing with something innate. That's certainly the simplest explanation, isn't it? Rather than that you flip the coin 1,000 times and it comes up heads every time. Is that plausible?
Is there anything in the animal kingdom that might refute that point? Is there any, certain animals where the woman is the dominant sort of sexual aggressor, or the?
So yes, but not animals that are similar to us. So like spiders or something like that.
Okay.
In terms of other primates, I mean there is variation with other primates. Bonobos are quite into casual sex, for instance. Bonobos are quite different.
Because people do get a little bit triggered. Because you're not saying that women don't enjoy sex at all.
No.
You're not saying that they aren't as horny in certain situations as men, but you're just saying on average, men are more keen on casual sex than women are.
Yes. And there are always outliers.
Of course.
I mean, you're talking about overlapping bell curves, right?
Yeah.
So the averages are different. But the thing with overlapping bell curves is it's more obvious at the tails. Mm-hmm. So for instance, like people who buy sex or people who become addicted to porn or something, they're basically entirely male, because you're talking about this sort of tippy tail of people who really, really desire sexual variety. Most people obviously are not out there. Most people are somewhere in the middle. But when you're talking about culture, you need to be thinking about the big picture. You need to be thinking like, okay, what does a culture of casual sex, how would a culture of casual sex affect men and women differently?
And how does it affect women differently? Because if you're saying that it's innate, it's not a sort of social construct. There's something deep within our wiring in men and women that makes us have a different sort of proclivity towards sex, casual sex. Why does that have a consequence that's negative for women?
Basically, what women are more likely to want is monogamy, like not necessarily marriage, but certainly signals of commitment. If you think about this in terms of our evolutionary history, it makes perfect sense, right? Because having sex is pretty much the most consequential thing a woman can do, right? Because if you get pregnant, you've got 9 months of pregnancy, which is risky in itself, childbirth, which is very risky in the ancestral environment, less so now, fortunately. And then you've got maybe 15 years or something of having to look after a child until it's capable of being economically self-sufficient. That's an enormous thing to happen in your life. Whereas, and it also means that women can only really reproduce once a year, absolute max, right? Whereas men, in theory, can reproduce thousands of times a year and can have basically no involvement in raising the children, take basically no risks whatsoever. So if you look at it in those terms, of course women would be pickier. Of course they would. And that is indeed what we see. But I think that the reason that young women express so much unhappiness at the moment with the sexual culture is that a lot of young women kind of go along with it. I know this is kind of surprising to men, right? And I've spoken to men about this who find this completely bemusing. They're like, if you don't want to have sex, don't have sex. It's fine. Like, what's the big problem? Like, women are so lucky because they can't step out onto the street without being propositioned. They can have, they have so much choice. Like, you girls are so lucky. What are you complaining about? And I think it's this problem that two problems. One is that both sexes are not necessarily very good at understanding what the other sex actually want. And that's partly comes from the fact that I don't think we're honest enough about sex differences. So like men think that the fact that women can get casual sex at any time of any day is amazing. And women are like, but I don't want that. That's like horrible. I don't want to shag some random man on the street, right? So there's that gap in there's that empathy gap. And similarly, I think women have an empathy gap. Like they probably don't realize how many men basically don't have access to any kind of sexual relationships and feel incredibly resentful and frustrated about that. They don't realize how scary it is for men to approach a woman, things like that. So there's like a mutual sort of incomprehension. And I think the other thing is men find it very hard to imagine doing what a lot of young women do, which is basically going along with sex that they don't really want to have because they want to be polite. And because they don't want to scare off a man who maybe they do fancy. And because they don't want to be uncool, and because they don't want to be weird, and they don't want to be a prude. One of the features of teenage girl psychology, and maybe this is into the 20s as well, but particularly teenage girls, is teenage girls are so concerned about what's normal. Whenever you have contagious mental illnesses, which like historically are quite common, so something like the Salem witch trials, apparently girls are now getting Tourette's from TikTok because it's like a viral thing on TikTok. Hysteria in the 19th century, anorexia. There's a lot of examples of these, right, where mental illnesses which are seen to be socially contagious, people catch it from each other, you end up with this mimetic effect. They always start with teenage girls, always. Sometimes they spread to other groups, but teenage girls are always like the first, And I think it's because teenage girls, probably for self-protective reasons, there must be some adaptive reason here, are very, very socially sensitive. They're very constantly aware of their social position, what other people are doing, what's cool, what's not cool, obsessed, which is also translates to things like fashion and slang. Slang, ditto. A lot of slang starts with teenage girls because they're this very mimetic group, right? Mm. And that's fine. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does sometimes have bad effects. And one of them is, for instance, the idea that being a prude is incredibly cringe has taken hold really, really effectively among this group of girls. And so, I'll talk to girls or read or listen to girls saying I went along with the most degrading, upsetting, whatever, sexual things because I don't know why, because I wanted him to think I was cool, because I didn't, and I think that's something that a lot of people find difficult to empathize with.
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.